Lenin clearly understood now that, and the Bolsheviks understood that now was the time for the insurrection. Now there was a time when the old regime could be overthrown. Now all the things that weren't there in the July days were there. Now we can have an insurrection. So, and therefore, a date did have to be set. Clearly, we do have to set a date here. We do have to have we can't just announce to everybody, you know, that we're going to have an insurrection where we actually take power on a certain day. But always insisting that the insurrection really was part of the mass movement. Now, these two things can seem a contradiction, but Trotsky had a phrase where he said, in a workers' revolution, in a socialist revolution, the conspiracy is always subordinate to the mass action. The two things can happen. Of course, there has to be you can't say to everybody we're going to take over the Winter Palace at this particular time. However, it was the case that they did tell that every decision was still taken as part of the sort of mass Soviet action. So, for instance, one man called Podvoisky talked about the Military Revolutionary Committee that was set up in order to deal with the insurrection, and he said the committee is an extended bureau. He said that this is a discussion he has with Lenin. He says to Lenin, the Military Revolutionary Committee is an extended bureau of the military organisations of the Bolshevik Party. Lenin says, and that is wrong. It should not be a bureau, but a non-party, insurrectionary body which has full power and is connected with all sections of workers and soldiers. The committee must ensure that an unlimited number of workers are armed and participate in the insurrection. There must not be the slightest hint of dictatorship by the Military Revolutionary Committee. Lenin wrote extensively at the time about the difference between a Bolshevik insurrection and an insurrection along the lines of a man called Louis Blanc, who was in the 19th century, who was someone who believed in a coup d'etat. The Cossacks were invited, you know, the people who could potentially be the people who would put down the revolution. They were invited to the Soviet to discuss the idea of the revolution. At the same time, they did privately have this meeting, the Bolsheviks, and the extraordinary thing, the meeting where they decided upon the insurrection, being on the October the 25th, one of the marvellous things about history is that it took place in Sukhanov's own flat, because his wife was a Bolshevik, and she sent Sukhanov away on some errands and told him to stay away for the night, and while he was away they had the meeting where they decided on the October the 25th. What that did to their marriage is not recorded, I don't believe. And every aspect now of the revolution, every aspect of it, how do you get the guns? You know, this can be one of the things. Well, if it's not a coup, how on earth do you get the guns? And so Trotsky writes about having to undertake and to arm the workers, the Soviet had to find a way to get the weapons, which didn't happen all at once. He says, when a delegation from the workers came to me and said they needed weapons, I answered, the arsenals, you see, are not in our hands. So they answered, but we have been to the Sestrorex arms factory. Well, and what about it? The workers said, they said that if the Soviets ordered, they would deliver. I gave an order for 5,000 rifles as an experiment, and they got them the same day. Quite what David Trimble would make of that, I'm not sure. Every aspect of it involving the mass of the people, even the most extraordinary. I mean, would they teach you this at military school? One of the problems about the insurrection was the Peter and Paul fortress in a crucial place in Petrograd. How do we get the Peter and Paul fortress? And there was all sort of people stood around looking at the charts and so on. How on earth do we get our way of getting the Peter and Paul fortress? And Trotsky had one answer that wouldn't really be taught you in a military school. We go down there, speak to the guards, and we win them over to the revolution. All right. And being Trotsky, of course, he'd come back an hour later and went, yeah, done that. The Soviets, the description of the Soviet is that all Petrograd, with the exception of its upper strata, was one solid meeting. In auditoriums, continually packed to the doors, audiences would be entirely renewed in the course of a few hours. Fresh and ever fresh waves of workers, soldiers and sailors would roll up to the buildings and flood them full. The petty bourgeoisie of the town bestirred themselves too, aroused by these waves and those warnings, while tens of thousands brimmed that immense building known as the House of the People. They filled all the theatres, filled the auditoriums of the theatres, smoke rooms, buffets and foyers, filling them with a solid and excited and at the same time disciplined mass. Iron columns and upstairs windows, from upstairs windows and iron columns, human heads, legs and arms hung in garlands and clusters. There was electric tension in the air which forebodes a coming discharge. Down with Kerensky, down with the war, power to the Soviets. Nothing there there then about a coup, very opposite of a coup. Masses of people changing society. There's a woman, Evgenia Bosch, who wrote, probably pronounced that wrong, but she wrote about the meetings at the time. There was no coughing or nose blowing, those first indications of boredom in an audience. Silence and order were complete, which is, you'd think, yes, that is right, actually, isn't it? You know, when you sort of hear, how bored must people be? But they do psychologically go, as a way of going, well, that'll kill half a second. Every aspect of society then, of overturning society, really been subordinate to the idea it had to be the mass of people. The Kiev Bolsheviks cabled and said, we're going to have our own insurrection. And Lenin was absolutely firm and adamant about saying, no, you don't control the Soviets. You don't control the Soviets. Therefore, it would be completely wrong. Again, not a moral thing. It would be completely wrong for the Kiev party to stage an insurrection because you haven't won. You haven't gone through the process of ridding yourself of the crap of ages and so on. Trotsky in September was elected as the leader of the Petrograd Soviet. The Bolsheviks everywhere were winning the votes now in the Soviets. Soldiers' committees were fleeing from the front and returning to Petrograd, where the provisional government had sort of sent them away, abandoned Petrograd, get rid of the Petrograd garrison, and the garrison refused to go, and so on. Every aspect of it, the mass of the workers, the post office, the banks and so on were all taken over by Red Guards that were recruited from the factories. Lectures were organised to the factories where the women worked, where they were all given lectures in how to come out and nurse the wounded. And so on. There were spies in the military school. They had 40 spies in the military school that would come round and sort of report to the Soviets. This is what the provisional government are planning to do. Every aspect of the revolution, really, trying to involve the mass of the people. But, of course, there were one group, the Vyborg district, was given the job, imagine given this job by the centre, they were given the job of stealing the keys to the drawbridge that led to the Winter Palace. And now, I don't know what you do that if sort of someone from the CC rings, this is your job for your branch this week. They were given and somehow they did it, they stole the keys to the drawbridge and so on. There has to be an HQ in every district, said Trotsky. Complete opposite from a coup. What sort of military coup would, imagine Pinochet doing that? An HQ in every district. If one of us is arrested, if the HQ in Smolny Institute is arrested, there is an HQ amongst the sailors at Kronstadt on the Aurora ship and so on, which Kerensky wanted to get out. He wanted to send it out because he knew that they were revolutionaries. The sailors on the Aurora said, no, we're refusing to go, and so on. And so, every aspect of it, really involving mass action. So much so that Trotsky talked about the insurrection itself, when they took control of the Winter Palace, talked about it as an anticlimax, because in fact we'd taken control of the whole of the city. We'd taken control of everything. Therefore it's almost as if it was an anticlimax. The final thing, right, we've now taken power. It wasn't a massive thing with tanks and so on rolling through the streets. We just did the final. It took 12 hours to actually capture the Winter Palace, and Kerensky fled off. Everybody, or the mass of the population, supported the Bolsheviks. He used the analogy of a mountain climber who looks for the summit and suddenly realises he's already on top of it and thinks, well, oh, we're here now, we've done it, and so on. And so, very finally, what happened is that the provisional government hung on a while in the Winter Palace, 12 hours, as I say. Then in the end it was decided that the sailors on the Aurora should fire a couple of blanks. Kerensky cracked himself, as you would, to be fair to the man, and out he went. And so, Trotsky then, at the Congress of Soviets that coincided quite deliberately with the revolution, talked about this Congress of Soviets, the people that were there, the people that were now the government. These people I'm going to talk about here, this is the government now of Russia. He says, the officers' chevrons, eyeglasses and neckties of the first Congress have all but disappeared. The delegates, especially from the trenches, are unshaven in old trench coats with heavy fur hats on their dishevelled hair, cotton sticking through a hole in their coarse weather-beaten faces, heavy cracked hands, fingers yellow with tobacco, buttons torn off, belts hanging loose, long unoiled boots, wrinkly and rusty. These were the people at the bottom of society. These were the people now that were running society. And so, the idea that the Bolshevik revolution was a coup, everything about the Bolsheviks, it seems to me, was about mass action. They had a chance of a coup, of taking power before they had the masses on their side in July. They didn't take it. The whole of society was being torn apart so that it could only go one way or the other, either a return to the military dictatorship or a move forward to a new revolution, and it involved the mass of the people. For those reasons, I would say the answer to, was the Bolshevik revolution a coup, is probably not.